So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Champion. My husband Don and I have been part of the Rivergum family since we moved to North Kellyville in 2018. I like seahorses, bushwalks, not hiking, seahorses, drives in the country, seahorses, mornings, seahorses, native birds and wildlife, and seahorses. My hobbies include machine embroidery, puzzle books, writing poetry and contemplations, playing my keyboard, playing my ukulele, and spending time with my family and friends. Over the last few months, my mind's been very focused on the names of Jesus. And over the Christmas period, particularly the name Emmanuel, God with us. And as I look over my life story, I believe that this is what I can acknowledge. God has been with me, beside me, and going before me all the way. He's prepared the way in so many circumstances. I've a few stories from my life to share with you, all of which, to me, bear out the fact that God has been there with me, for me to lean on, to rely on, to trust, and to give peace. My stories aren't very dramatic, and they don't have any really amazing climaxes, but to me, and I hope to you, they tell a story of God being there throughout and supplying my needs as they arose. I've chosen as my main theme from the Bible, Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 8. Moses was aging and nearing his end, and he called Joshua to him, and in the presence of all Israel handed the leadership of the people over to Joshua, telling him to be strong and courageous, and then that the Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. But firstly, my background. I grew up in Toongabbie, the only girl in our family with 4 brothers. I always loved reading, writing stories and poetry, and dreamed of one day actually being a writer or a journalist. But I left school when I was 15, after just 2 years of high school, and went to work at what was then the British and Foreign Bible Society in Bathurst Street, Sydney, as their junior office girl. By the time I left there to have our son Stephen, I'd gone to college to learn typing and flunk shorthand, and was the receptionist-telephonist in the office. Recently, in that revered place of all knowledge and wisdom called Facebook, I came across an article by someone called Rebecca Brown. It reads, "God won't give you more than you can handle." Odd, I can't seem to find that verse, she writes. Then she continues, "I'm guessing Job would take exception to that cliche, so would Joseph, and Paul definitely did. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Why would God allow him to experience hurt more than he could handle? If we read on, so that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God." The truth? Cancer is more than you can handle. So is infidelity. So is caregiving. So is rejection. So is death and loss and grief and prodigal children and 101 other life struggles. God doesn't expect you to handle it. He expects you to hand it over to him. He doesn't want you relying on your strength, but on his. If we keep walking around thinking, God won't give me more than I can handle, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. The good news, he beckons for your burdens. Cast your cares upon me. You will never know relief until you do. Now to my story. The first part of my story is about God's plan, not mine. When Don and I married, I moved from Toongabbie to Old Toongabbie. Early in our married life, we became convinced that God was calling us to serve him in the outback. But when we applied, we'd been trying for a baby. We decided that if God wanted us to go, we would not be pregnant, but I was. So while we were happy about the baby, we were very disappointed about not going on mission. Our minister, Reverend Bob Wyndham, counselled us that not everyone was called to go, but that God probably had something in mind for us to do for him there in Old Toongabbie. As it turned out, Stephen was born premature, and what his outcomes would have been had we been in a remote place, I hate to imagine. It wasn't until Stephen was 12 years old that God showed us our mission, Boys Brigade. So for 35 years, Don and I served in the Boys Brigade company that we started in 1983, as well as in the battalion, state and federal bodies. I was battalion anchor boy leader for a few years, as well as writing a 3-year program for the 5 to 8-year-olds for the state. To enable me to fulfil my desire to always be there for my children, I took on family daycare for a number of years to boost our income a little and to help pay for things like music and dancing lessons, coaching in ice skating, tennis, and the various other activities the children participated in. We've got 4 children, Stephen, Alison, Wesley and Philip. We now have 8 grandchildren and recently became great Nana and Poppy Don to our granddaughter Kira's 8-year-old foster daughter. And that is a real joy. The next part of my story is about desire. At one point, I was a member of our church's council. Our minister, Reverend Youngday Lee, at one meeting presented me with a church magazine from his previous placement. His exact words were, "Jennifer, I want our church to have a magazine something like this. I want you to be responsible for it." I was gobsmacked, to say the least. How could I do something like this? I only had 2 years of high school. I had no special training. All I had was the work I'd been doing in Boys Brigade and family daycare, and I attended KYB. I can't do this. But never liking to deny a challenge, I set about figuring out what was required. I asked the members of the congregation to hand me any stories or pictures or articles which they thought might be of interest to the church, and set about compiling our first edition. Our minister insisted that I should write an editorial, and I also created a children's page and included stories from the congregation. The congregation voted that it should be called In Tune, being in tune with each other, in tune with God, and in Toongabbie. Some members created their own column, which was included every time. We put the magazine out quarterly. Well, I ended up receiving letters from all over the place as members shared the magazine with friends because people just loved it. There were letters from people local and interstate who found the magazine an encouragement. It was a real learning time for me, and I felt that God had known my desire to write and had given me In Tune as a gift. The next part is called God Went Before. In 1998, Don and I headed off on a Red Centre safari coach tour with his work colleagues from Shell at Clyde. During the preceding week, I'd been really unwell with a terrible virus. I spent the entire week in bed. I said at the time that if someone gave me a gun, I would have used it. I ached all over and was absolutely miserable. However, Thursday came and I was feeling a bit better, so we decided to go ahead with the trip. I've lost my place. Here we go. By Friday morning, I thought I was well and truly on top of it. So we joined the trip, which left from the refinery at Clyde. We stopped a couple of times through the day, and I found it increasingly difficult to keep going. But I was determined this, our first big trip, was not going to be ruined. That night, we erected our tents in Cobar. I tried to eat some dinner, but only managed a few mouthfuls of soup and headed off to bed. During the night, I began having really severe chest pains. I tried Panadol to no effect. And in the end, around 1 a.m, I woke Don and asked him to arrange an ambulance, which he did. The ambulance officers came. There was a young blonde lady and a big, beefy, whiskery man. They treated me, then put me in the ambulance to head for Cobar Hospital. As we pulled out of the campground, the big, beefy, bewhiskered man came in with a clipboard, that's right, and said, "Can you tell me your name?" I answered, then he asked, "And your address?" I began to answer, but he finished it off for me. "Did Don tell you?" I asked. And he said, "No, I was at your wedding." And I looked, and I couldn't recognise him. "I'm Roger Howard," he said. Oh my goodness, I couldn't believe it. The last time we saw Roger, he was younger, clean-shaven, working and living on the Central Coast in the NRMA office. And here he was in Cobar, an ambulance officer. Roger and his wife Kate had Don stay with them while I was in hospital in the house adjoining the ambulance station. I was treated for angina and was really spoiled there in Cobar. When I was discharged with instructions to see a cardiologist, we decided to contact our friend Gwen Parnell, who we knew worked in that field. Before we left Cobar, we were able to arrange an appointment with her boss, Dr. Abrahams. We spent a week with Roger and Kate before heading home by bus and train. After seeing Dr. Abrahams, I was given a series of tests, culminating with an angiogram. The doctor concluded that while I did have some issues with my heart, the symptoms I had experienced in Cobar were most likely caused by the virus I'd been suffering, inflaming the lining of my heart. What an amazing thing God did. He went before with Roger and Kate already there in Cobar for when we'd be needing them. Having Gwen as a long-time friend, willing and able to help out with the doctor, I've been grateful ever since for the way God was there for me throughout this difficult time. But I always felt a sense of peace through the whole time, knowing God was there with me. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. The next part of my story is about peace. In 2001, I had an at-fault car accident. I had to go to court, so we contacted another Christian friend who had a brother involved in law. Actually turned out he was a magistrate. And he gave us the name of a solicitor we could contact. The process took what seemed like forever to get dealt with. I fronted up 3 or 4 times to magistrates, but each time the DPP said they weren't ready to proceed. Eventually, the first magistrate I saw on one particular day told him she wanted the matter dealt with on that day, that I'd been messed about for long enough. So I had to have an interview with a person who was to decide if I was a risk to the community or if I could be trusted to fulfil any obligation I was given, for example, community service or so on. He concluded I was a decent, trustworthy person. Excuse me. So back before another magistrate we went. When the time came for me to stand up to hear my fate, I felt a sense of peace just wash over me, peace and calm. I knew that Christian friends were praying for me in that moment. I could feel it. God gave me his peace when I needed it. The magistrate commented that he could see from the information before him that I was an upstanding citizen, actively serving my community, and that because of this he would be imposing the minimum sentence allowed. I was suspended from driving for a year, plus had to be of good behaviour for a year, and had no costs or other penalties imposed on me. Then after 12 months, I had to pass the learner driver's test on the computer, which I actually managed to do. And I was on the road again. God had gone before, as my service for him had actually influenced my outcome. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. God's answer and confirmation of his will is the next part of my story. Sorry. Fast forward to this past year. I'm a member of the CWCI E3 Sydney Women's Convention Committee. It's a mouthful, which I joined after I'd been attending the convention since about 1975 and attending KYB for most of that time as well. This is how our meetings have looked lately. Is it there? Yep. That's how our meetings have been, like everyone else's. My job on the committee is called signs. I make sure there are signs to keep the ladies attending the convention informed about where to be and when, and signs to encourage them and so on. Basically, if we need a sign, I make it. Simple. But since joining the committee, I've found myself doing other things, organising craft activities, chairing sessions, writing poetry and running what we called Everyone Has a Story, a time when ladies can volunteer to give a short testimony. Well, last year, our chairman, Adele, requested a year off from the role because her counselling business had grown very busy, largely because of COVID. I was asked to accept nomination for the role. I was horrified. Here I was, comfortably on the committee, picking and choosing which jobs I would do, and they want me to take the wheel? Me? So I prayed about it. I had no peace. I thought, I need training, I need more than I've got. I was really struggling to sleep because it was on my mind. So I asked our Connect group to pray about it, which they did. That was Thursday morning. Thursday night, I opened my book that I use for devotions, called A Little God Time for Women, and this is what I found. The title is Let Me First. Obedience to Christ is both an awesome and challenging endeavour. Listening to the voice of God and obeying that voice isn't easy. God will ask us to do things that don't make sense, and his schedule will not always line up with our own. It can be tempting for us to want our ducks in a row before we start following Christ into something. With our human agendas and preferences, we like to make sure we've crossed off our to-do lists before moving forward. And the Bible reading is the one about Jesus calling people to follow them, but they've always got something else to do. In my case, it was, I'm just not ready. When God speaks to you and calls you to something, instead of telling him what you need to do first, obey without hesitation. God isn't interested in the to-do lists of this world. He has a kingdom agenda with an eternal perspective. If you could see what he can see, you would never say, let me first. I knew right then and there that I should accept the nomination. I slept well that night, and the next morning I notified the committee of my decision. But the story doesn't end there. The following Sunday, Troy introduced us to the Chinese finger traps. Do you remember those? He spoke about how the more we pull away, the more we feel caught. Freedom is found in pressing into God. I was restless because I was pulling away from the task God wanted me to accept. I had no peace, but when I leaned into God and accepted his will, I found peace and I even slept well. I knew on that Sunday that I'd made the right decision. I still find the task daunting. At the moment, I'm finding it very difficult to sit down and write the run sheets for the convention. I keep putting it off because I'm struggling with it and the fact that I might mess it up. And in particular, the lady who does the PowerPoints relies on those run sheets in order to do her job. But I know when I eventually do get into and do it, God will give me everything I need to get the task done. So those are the stories from this particular member of the Rivergum family. Be patient, God has a fair plan for you. God knows the longing of your heart. He knows before we do what we will be needing, rest in him, and know his presence. Trust him for calm and peace when you need it. Ask friends to pray. When in doubt, rely on God to show you with certainty what he wants you to do. And again, ask friends to pray. And if you're asked to pray about something, be diligent in your prayers. In summary, I can confirm with all confidence that God has a plan for your life. He knows the desires of your heart. God goes before. He can give you peace. He will make his will for you known. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. So if you do not know for sure that God has a plan for your life, but you want to be sure, if you're not sure God knows the desires of your heart, if you're not certain God goes before you, if you want to know God's will for you, if you do not know God's peace but you want it, please make today the day you do something about it. Speak to someone before you leave this place. Or if you're watching online, contact Oversight and someone will get back to you to help you be certain of these things. I was fortunate. I grew up being taught about these things, but I acknowledge that not everyone has this advantage. Please, if you want to know, do something about it now. Don't delay.